Now what I'm going to do, rather than a long introduction as to when this gospel was written and why it was written and all those sorts of things, I'm just going to look at the text itself and come back to those questions naturally as we go through the text itself. Now obviously if any of you has a Bible, that would be a big help. When I'm teaching, I say, you dare to come to a biblical. I got mine, so you're okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use this presentation of the shape of Mark's story because it's a story. With a beginning and a middle and an end, and it's all connected. And this is one of the things, of course, that we lose in our liturgy because we only read little bits of it. And each Sunday, we're not aware of what went on last Sunday, and sometimes when I'm on, I say, what was the gospel about last week? Because it's important for understanding this week to know what it went on last week. I never allow anybody to try to answer. They all shudder, and they're in the back row anyway, so we don't want to push them back. But it's very important to understand a gospel, any gospel, to see it as a whole piece of literature. It's actually a narrative, a story that's put together in a certain way. And so I want to take you through that story and go from beginning to end, show you how it's all connected and what the storyteller is doing by telling it this way. And there are 4 Gospels, as you know. A wonderful story about one night going out to Layla to talk to parents of the children who were to receive some sacrament. So all the sacraments that they were going to receive, all the parents had to be there, and if they didn't turn up, they weren't going to have, their children weren't going to be admitted to the sacrament. So it was packed. And very tough people, truck drivers and all the rest, guys there with just their tank tops on straight off the job. And I could see that there's about 300 people, and I was supposed to talk about the Gospels. I thought to myself, this is going to be a bit tricky. So I started off by saying, how many Gospels are there? Not one end. 300 people. So eventually, a fella with a big black beard, about the 4th row from the front, put his hand up and he said, 12. That's a good start. There were 12 disciples and we called them apostles, 12. And we started there. And by the time we finished the night, we'd all learned to say together, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, hold the horse while I do. So we'll start there tonight. I'll finish there at it later, but we'll start there tonight with Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, hold the horse while I go. Mark was the first to give us a story. So he's the oldest. Even though in the Bible you find it Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, as I've just said. In fact, Mark is the shortest and in some way, in terms of its Greek, the simplest and the most direct. And Matthew and Luke are clearly using, as they've got it in front of them, as they're writing their own stories. So Mark stands alone as the very first. And so when he begins his gospel with this prologue, first 13 verses, and he begins by saying, the beginning of the good news of Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, he's the first one to do that. He's the first one to write a story of Jesus and call it good news. Good news. The word in Greek for good news is evangelion, but in Old English it's Godspell. Gospel. So, Mark is convinced that what he's about to tell us is good news. A word widely used to proclaim the good news even in the secular world. victory that had been won. The emperor had had a son. All these things is evangelium, good news. And this is a new type of good news. And the good news is this life story. So, what we know as a gospel, that term gospel, applied to a story that was invented by Mark. So he started off the beginning of the gospel, of the good news. And the good news is that Jesus of Nazareth is the Christ, the Son of God. Now this doesn't sound like a very objective piece of storytelling. If you were to open up a book and it began the good news about Donald Trump, the greatest American that ever lived and the saviour of humankind, you'd be aware you're about to read a prejudiced book. Well, this is a prejudiced book. The Gospel of Mark is a prejudiced book. It's shot through with the prejudice, with the belief that the story of Jesus is the story of the Messiah, the Son of God. However, there are going to be some funny turns on the way. But before we start getting into the funny turns, he writes this prologue. Now, the prologue is crucial to understand what Mark is doing with this story. Because he's going to give you and me, who read the prologue or hear the prologue, and in the earliest times, not too many people could read, so it was read to them or even acted on the stage. The Gospels were acted and spoken, because there is possibly as low as about 2% of people could read in some places. And he starts off these 13 verses by telling us that it's a story about the Christ, the Son of God, and then the very first person who speaks is God. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah. He quotes the prophet. And the prophet Isaiah talks about, I'm sending a messenger ahead of you, a voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. So he's not only Messiah in Christ, but he's Lord. And then the baptizer appears. We get a little indication of the baptizer baptizing. And then he begins to speak. The one who is more powerful than I. Iskiroteros is the Greek word. The more powerful one, which is an Old Testament Greek word for God. So there's this divine figure. I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie the thumb of his sandals. I baptize you with water. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. So he's going to have the Holy Spirit, which he can communicate. Now we haven't met him yet. Then he appears. And he's baptized. As he's coming out of the water, a voice comes from heaven and says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The Spirit drives him into the wilderness. So the Spirit's got possession of him. Drives him into the wilderness, tempted for 40 days, very brief in Mark, just half a verse. Then it says, he was with the wild beasts, and the angels ministered to him. This is a reversal of what happened in Genesis. In the book of Genesis, once disobedience and sin broke into the story, what was one of the things that happened? The earth rebelled, the animals rebelled, and tensions grew between man and woman. This is the result of sin. But Jesus is with the wild beast. The situation of Eden, the paradise situation, is restored. And the angels fed him. Now this is not in the Bible, but this is in Jewish literature prior to Christianity, because the Jews wondered about, well, they weren't allowed to eat forbidden fruit. What did they eat? What did they live off? And the Jewish tradition is angels fed them. End of the prologue. What do we know? We know Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, the Lord, the stronger one, whose bootstraps the Baptist can't even do. He's full of the Spirit. The voice of God from above says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased," and he restores the situation of humankind as it was before the fall. And we've only read 13 verses. Now, what's happening? We have been told all the answers about who Jesus is before we even start reading the story. Now, this is a technique used by authors, classical authors, that Mark has picked up. If you ever go to watch a Greek drama, a Greek play, Sophocles or something like that, you will see the first thing, a group will come onto the stage, a choir, and they will say, "This is a story about a young man who met another man at a crossroad and killed him." Then he was not aware that that man he killed was in fact his father. And he then goes on to marry his mother, and great tragedy followed. So you've just heard the prologue to Oedipus Rex. Prologue to Oedipus the King. So you know the story. You know what's going to happen. So it tells you what is going to happen. The prologue to Mark and all those things that I've just told you tells you what Jesus does, who he is, but it doesn't tell you how he does it. Now, this is a deliberate literary technique. Through the gospel, you're going to find people encountering Jesus all the time. And you will see they don't understand. They fail, particularly the disciples fail. And you know when they are wrong and why they are wrong. You know because you've read the prologue. You know the answers. But the people in the story don't know the answer. You are a privileged reader. You go into the story knowing who Jesus is. But you're going to find that this is a pretty funny way for God to deal with his beloved. Because in the end, he's going to finish up on a cross, yelling out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So this is the Father who is pleased with his Son. And at the end, we're going to find the Son calling out to the Father, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A rather funny way for a God to be dealing with his beloved Son. Yet, what's said in the prologue is shown to be true through the life of Jesus, but it's very surprising. It's surprisingly true. And this is where Mark is so very creative. The next section I'm going to look at is the section that runs across what I call the Galilean Ministry. Now, I've got some technical words there. I say textual markers. All right, what do I mean by that? I mean by that across this section of the Gospel from 1:14, so we've just finished the prologue, you know who he is, you've just heard all that. Now you're going to start actually reading the story, the life story. And you're going to be taken through this very systematically by an author who knows what he's doing. And to show us, readers and listeners, what he's doing and how he's doing it, he uses the technical term, I use the technical term, textual markers. So what's that mean? In the text itself, he tells us he's moving from one thing to another. Rather than talk in general terms, let me show you what I mean. On 3 occasions, we get a summary of Jesus' ministry. We then get disciples involved, And then after events, people make a decision. Summary, disciples, decision. What should happen? We've just finished the prologue, down as far as verse 13. We're up to verse 14. Now listen to this summary statement. After John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee, proclaiming the good news of God and saying, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news. That is a summary of Jesus' ministry. He's preaching the good news, asking people to repent. He might have said this 50 times, 150 times. But what you get here is a summary statement of the preaching of Jesus. The time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God has come near. Turn around and walk into that kingdom. So that's a summary of Jesus' message. So verses 14 to 15 are a summary. We then immediately meet 1:16 to 20, disciples. The vocation of the first disciples. These stories of the vocation of the first disciples are a model of how disciples should respond. Jesus is moving, as he is all the way through the Gospel of Mark. He's forever moving something, responding somehow to something that's bigger than him. And as he's moving, he sees. And all the verbs are he's doing it. He sees. He calls. He says. So, first of all, he calls two of them. We told what they were. Fishermen. Follow me and I will make you fishing for people. And immediately, Mark uses the word immediately more than all the other texts in the New Testament together. Immediate. Everything's immediate. It's all urgent. So immediately, they leave everything and they follow him. He goes on again. He sees again James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother. We find out what they're doing in the boat, mending their nets. He calls them. They leave their father Zebedee in the boat and the hired men and they follow him. Two vocation stories. Jesus on the move. Jesus sees. Jesus calls. They drop everything. They leave their hired boats. They leave their hired servants. They leave their boats. They leave the father. This is Zebedee and son. This is a big fishing industry. We always think of these disciples as sort of no-hopers. These are very successful fishermen. And they leave it all behind because Jesus is called. It didn't happen like that. That's the way it should happen. You understand? So, summary, disciples. If you were to read Luke 5, 1 to 11, you'd see Jesus in the same scene says to Peter, throw down your net. And Peter, this is not in the text, I'm putting this in. You might be a good preacher, but I'm a good fisherman. And we've been fishing all night and we haven't caught anything. However, at your word, I'll put it down. That's more like what happened. There's gradual movement into discipleship, as it is with all of us. But the ideal is presented in 1:16 to 20. If you were to turn over to 3:6, you would find that after a passage that we'll come back and look at, a decision is made about Jesus. In 3:6, we're told, the Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Pharisees and Herodians don't talk to one another. They're two ends of the same, of the social prism. Pharisees are observant Jews, more observant than anyone, they thought. The Herodians were those who had sold their souls to the foreign power, to the Roman authority. And yet they come together to decide how to get rid of Jesus. Now, between the marker, between the summary, the disciples and the decision at the end, Jesus encounters the leaders of Israel. So across the passage from 1:17 all the way through to 3:6, he's continually running into the leadership of Israel. To start with, he bursts on the scene and he carries everything in front of him. He cures the sickness of Simon Peter's mother. He overcomes a leper. And in both of those miracles, he not only works the miracle, but he breaks through taboo. He touches Simon Peter's mother-in-law. A man never touches a woman, not even his wife, in public. He touches a leper, which you don't do. So Jesus breaks through boundaries, and then they let the man down through the roof, and he tells him his sins are forgiven. And conflict begins. Who is this guy who claims he can forgive sin? Only God does that. And then one after another, he has episodes in which he argues with Jewish leadership. Until you get to 3:6, in which they decide, we've got to sort this guy out. The Pharisees and the Herodians immediately went out and just tried to plan how to destroy him. So that first section, beginning with the summary of 14 to 15, ending with the decision of Israel that they've got to get rid of him, is filled with various accounts, one beside the other, which show a mounting crisis between Jesus and the leaders of Israel, which leads to the decision that he must be got rid of. And so I would call the first section, Jesus and the leaders of Israel. Secondly, listen to 3:7. Another summary. Jesus departed with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him, hearing all that he was doing. They came, this is when you really begin to get the summary. They came to him in great numbers from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea beyond the Jordan, the region around Tyre and Sidon, even Gentiles. So people in Jerusalem and Judea, across the Jordan, up in the north, and even as far north as Tyre and Sidon, which is a Gentile land. So he's going around all of these places, and he told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, so that they would not crush him. For he had cured many, so that all who had diseases pressed upon him to touch him. Whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before the Lord and shouted, "You are the Son of God." But he sternly ordered them not to make him known. This is another summary. This is what he was doing. Cured many, but they're pressing upon him. Whenever the unclean spirits they fell down and said, "You are the Son of God." But he orders them not to make him known. This is a summary of what Jesus was doing among all these people. That is immediately followed from verses 13 to 19 with discipleship material. He calls the first 12. He calls the 12. And in verse 14 we're told he calls them to be with him. To be with him. So that they might be able to go out. So that they might be able to proclaim the message. So that they might be able to have authority and cast out demons. In the disciple passage in the first section, he simply calls them. In the disciple passage in the second section, he gives them a mission. But the essential part of the mission is to be with him. He calls them to be with him so that they might go out, so that they might preach, so that they might drive out demons, so that they might cure. In other words, everything that Jesus has done as far as 3:7, they can now do. He gives them authority to do what he has done. But what's the essential to do it? They must be with him. All of the things about doing are locked in, even grammatically, they're subordinated to be with him. To be with him so that they might go out, so that they might teach, so that they might... In other words, if you're not with him, it won't work. And this is a very big criterion for discipleship in the Gospel of Mark, and we'll see it, that they will fail completely. In chapter 14, verse 50, we will see, before midnight tonight, chapter 14, verse 50, we will see the last time we hear of the disciples is, and they all forsook him and fled. End of the disciples in this story. Never see them again. Peter hangs on for a little while, just to deny him 3 times. But they are no longer with him. So, this is the essential element of being a disciple, is to be with him so that you might do what he has done. And then you get the list of the names, which is very powerful. Generally jump those lists when we see them when we're running away, but the list, the name goes all the way down until you get to the 12th. And Judas Iscariot, and our texts say, who betrayed him. But the Greek uses the verb paradidomi, which means who threw him away, cast him off. So, 3:13 to 19 begins with the necessity to be with Jesus so that you can do what Jesus does. A list of names ends with somebody who threw him away, who separated himself from him. Then you get a whole series of episodes following on from that second discipleship passage, which deals with a new family of Jesus. All right, so we've got a struggle now going on with the leaders of Israel. What's he do next? He sets up a new parable, a new family. 3:20, 3:19, the end of it. Then he went home. He went to his house. And the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. So he goes home and he can't even have a feed. When his family heard this, they went out to restrain him. And they were saying, he's out of his mind. His blood family think he's nuts. They can't understand what's going on. Then immediately after that, his religious and his national family, the Israelites, come to him and say, he has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of the demons he casts them out. And then Jesus teaches them, you can be forgiven all sins, but not to claim that what I do comes from evil. So that's the unforgivable sin, which claims that Jesus is the creator of evil. So not only does his blood family think he's nuts, but his national family and his religious family think he's demon-possessed. And at the end of the chapter, immediately after that, verses 31 to 35, in chapter 3, then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. The crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you. This is his blood family, eh? And he replied, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking around at those who were sitting with him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. And there is a new criterion for belonging to Jesus. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. So this is a new criterion for belonging to Jesus. You don't have to be a Jew. You don't have to belong to the blood family of Jesus. You are called to do the will of God. That makes you the family of Jesus. So we're having a new family being set up. Now that he's got a new family, all of chapter 4 and all of chapter 5 are dedicated to Jesus instructing his new family. Chapter 4 is one parable after another. If you look at them, they're all about small things that become big. Things that should get choked or die or whatever, but they don't. They grow. All of the parables, they're called parables of growth. Why does Jesus instruct his family, his new family, by means of these parables of growth? Because of the opposition that he's running into. He's running into the opposition from the leaders of Israel. He's running into opposition from his blood family and his national family. Well, this is going to be a bit tough. And it will be. But so you get the parable of the seed growing. You get the parable of the sower. You get the parable of the mustard seed, the tiny seed that becomes bigger. And he uses many such parables, and he spoke this word to them as they were able to hear them. He explains everything to them. So this is to instruct them that they should not be too concerned about the heavy opposition that he's running into, because in the end there will be a growth 30-fold, 60-fold, 90-fold, 100-fold. It won't be stopped. You put a plant in the ground, you go to sleep, but it grows. So the parables are all parables of growth to indicate that despite the impression that things are not going well, growth is happening. He then tells a series of miracles. Acts a series of miracles. And they're very beautiful. They are growing in importance. First, he calms a storm, a physical miracle in nature. Second, the remarkable story of the Gerasene demoniac. He overcomes 1,000 demons, a legion of demons. Then, this beautiful story of Jairus' daughter's father coming to him and ask him to help his daughter. On the way, the woman with the flow of blood comes along and wants to touch him, and is cured, and then he goes to Jairus' daughter. This is what we call a sandwich instruction. 2 pieces of bread on either end and one in the middle. 2 pieces of bread in the Jairus story, the one in the middle is the woman with the flow of blood. What we've got here is, this is to give you an idea of how skillful this man is. Jesus overcomes the threat of nature. He then overcomes the demonic. Very beautiful story, which we can't spend too much time on, but the demonic that he overcomes is in Gerasa. It's on the other side of the lake. He's in a Gentile land. And in this Gentile land, which has to be Gentile because there are pigs there, he cures this terribly afflicted person possessed with the demon. But he doesn't only drive the demon, the legion of demons, out of the man. The demons take possession of pigs and they all go into the abyss of the sea. Jesus purifies the man and he purifies the land. Impurity universally collapses in front of the presence of Jesus. But then he goes on to cure sickness in the woman and overcome death in the girl. So, nature, demons, sickness, death. You see the mounting importance of these miracles? And in this sandwich, there are 2 things that tie the episodes of the daughter of Jairus and the woman together. One of them is faith, because the faith of Jairus draws Jesus into them. The faith of the woman brings about her miracle. But the other thing is touch. Now these are women's stories. And you've got to remember the very severe laws about women and men touching. But these are two women, one who is perpetually ritually unclean, and she says, if I can only touch you. And then Jesus says, the same word was used all the time, up to me. Who touched me? And the disciples say, what a stupid question. Look at all these people crowding around you and you asked who touched me. And then the woman comes clear, and then he says, your faith has made you well. So the touch that should render Jesus impure renders her whole. And then the next thing he does is he goes in and he takes the hand of a dead person. Impure again. Takes the dead person by the hand. Now, we are told that the woman had a flow of blood for 12 years. We're told that the girl is 12 years old. So the girl is coming into womanhood. Two stories are put side by side because there's one story about a woman whose womanhood is keeping her excluded from God's people. She's forever impure. She's rendered whole and drawn back into her people, into her practice. And the girl is given life. So this is no idiot writing this, eh? This is beautifully put together. And then to end this section with his new family, I'll keep an eye on this, I want to finish the first half by 9. We won't keep it again, mate. To finish this, he goes back to his own hometown, 1 to 6. He left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. The disciples are always there. They've made one little mistake. So to this point, after he cured the sea, they say, who is this man that even the winds and the sea obey him? They're not sure who it is they're following. Who is this man? Now we know, don't we? How do we know? So when they ask that question, we should give that answer. Now just imagine what's going on if this is being first century Christian church and this is being performed. And the disciples say, who is this man? And you as an audience say, you idiots, he's the Son of God, the Christ. And we were a part of the story. We're responding to the failure of the disciples. That's their only mistake so far. But they're limping along, always with him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, where did this man get all this? Correct question. And then they asked, what is the wisdom that has been given to him? What's that refer to? All of the parables in chapter 4. What is that wisdom? He's just been giving us all these beautiful parables. What deeds of power are being done by his hand? All of the miracles of chapter 5. See how carefully this is all put together? Now they've asked the right question because they've observed his wisdom and his power. Where does he get it all? We know, don't we? We've read the Prologue. We know that this is because he is of God. He is the beloved Son of God. That's where the wisdom comes from. That's where the power comes from. But what do they say? This is the Son of Mary, brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon and are not his sisters here with us? And they took offence at him. They think he's just one of the local boys. They understand the origins of Jesus as being in the village. So this is Mary's son. But we know he's God's son. We know that because we've read the Prologue. We can see them making their mistake. They've come to a decision. And Jesus is shocked that his family, that his hometown have no faith. And then in 6b, very briefly, 6b to 8:30, then he went about the villages teaching. Summary. With me? Summary. You believe me now when I say we've got summary, disciples, decision? The first one was the summary. Then we had the call of the disciples. The decision was he must die. With the new family section, the summary was he's preaching all around and all the people coming to him. He's doing miracles, healing them, demons crying out who he was. A summary of Jesus' activity. Then his traditional family and his religious family reject him. And he creates a new criterion, which is belief in God. And he instructs them through word and miracle. And then he comes to his own town, and the decision is he's a nobody. He marries. So, summary, disciples, decision. 6b, summary. Then he went about among the villages teaching. The next section, 7 through, and I think 30, but I'll just do that quickly with you, is all about disciples. And the disciples are sent out on a mission. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2, and gave them authority over the unclean spirit. And you remember I pointed out that in the first section he calls them from what they're doing. In the second section he gives them authority to repeat what he's been doing under the condition that they remain with him. Third one, he sends them out. He sends them out to do what he has done. He gives them warnings. Tells them to take nothing except a staff and sandals. They are to be like him, itinerant preachers. The symbols of the staff and the sandals, they're still rich in our own liturgical world, aren't they? The staff and the sandals, indicative of Jesus' disciples, but indicative of Jesus himself. So they are to be, as Jesus was, the wandering preacher. Because they can only do what Jesus does if they are with Jesus. And then he gives them some warnings. Very interesting. Wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. If any place will not welcome you and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet and as a testimony against them. What's that all about? This warning appears in all of the missionary statements, and you find it in early Christian documents. A document from the end of the century, the early part of the 2nd century, called the Didache, which was instructions on mission. They're always told to do this. Why? Because there was obviously a problem among early Christian preachers. It was the practice, believe it or not, that the preacher would go into a village and find a place for Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the first people they go to. And after a while, they're working away and they see that Mr. and Mrs. Jones up the road have got a Mercedes in a swoon. So they change. So they would go from one place to the other. This is obviously happening in the early church. Because there's this regular instruction that when you get to a place, stay where you start. What's it saying? It's saying, put your lives where your words are. Don't preach the kingdom and live selfishly. This is clearly inserted into these missionary texts as a warning. These books are written late in the 1st century against missionaries who are doing this. They're looking for upward social movement because of their preaching. And they're warned not to. So they went out and proclaimed that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. That is immediately followed by the account very colourful account in Mark. It's shortened very radically in Matthew and in Luke of the execution of John the Baptist. So in Mark, this great folklore of the girl dancing and the Herodias and parties and all the rest of it, silver platters and the head on the platter, very gory and all very splendid, great Hollywood stuff. And then, when that's finished, the disciples come back from the mission. Just keep that in mind. Why do we get this Baptist thing in here? Read carefully, what happens to the Baptist is a foretaste of what will happen to Jesus. The Baptist is imprisoned because he proclaims the gospel. He tells King Herod that he's doing the wrong thing. He's in prison. Herod rather likes him, likes talking to him, thinks he can learn things from him, as Pilate does in the trial of Jesus. But he makes this silly promise, and under pressure, under peer pressure, he has to give in, as does Pilate. And thus, he is executed, as was Jesus. The only difference is that when he's been executed, his disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb, which the disciples of Jesus also did. But for John the Baptist, that's the end of the story. You don't hear any more. He stays in the tomb. So what we've got are disciples sent out in chapter 6, verse 7 to 13, with these very strong instructions about being like Jesus, and they are successful. They do the things that Jesus did. Then in between, we've got another sandwich construction here. We've got a model of a Jesus disciple who dies because he does what he does and says what he says. And then the disciples come back in verse 30, and the disciples who'd been sent out gathered around Jesus, and they began to tell him all the things that they had done and all the things that they had taught. Aren't we fantastic? They've forgotten that they're telling the bloke who enabled them to do it in the first place. So this is another indication of gradual misunderstanding of the disciples. And so Jesus asks them to come aside to a desert place all by yourselves and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. Then we run into this section where you get one bread miracle in chapter 6:32 all the way through to 44, and another bread miracle that you find in 8:1 to 10. These two bread miracles are crucial in understanding the story of Mark. And this is where our lectionary really gets it wrong. Next year, in the lectionary, we don't read any of the bread miracles from Mark. We don't read any of chapter 7, which is in between chapter 6 and chapter 8, which I'll show you in a minute is very important, because the wise men in Rome, many years ago, just after the council, decided we can't possibly keep reading Mark because there's two bread miracles. This will confuse the simple people. And most of the priests, I imagine. So what do? This whole section from Mark's Gospel drops out, and we read John 6 for 5 weeks. That's a bonus. But the fact is, you've lost Mark at the end of Mark 6 until halfway through Mark 8. And there's a very important thing going on here. And I'll just tell you this quickly. The first bread miracle is clearly the feeding of Jewish people. There are many signs that this is directed to Jewish people. The ones that are most obvious are the continual use of Psalm 22. They are like sheep without a shepherd. Have them sit down on the green grass, in verdant pastures he will lead them. And when everyone has plenty to eat, nothing will I lack. So there's this background of a psalm. They are gathered in 50s and 100s as they are gathered for the Exodus. So there's this groups of 50s and 100s, which are explicitly mentioned as the groups of Israel. It's also the way in which they gathered at Qumran. After they've fed them, there are 12 baskets full. 12. This is on the Gentile side of the lake. There are all of these indications, there are many others, but there are all of these indications that this is Jesus nourishing a Gentile crowd, and the language that's used recalls the Eucharist. Okay? When it says, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. That's the other thing we should mention. The disciples want to send them away. This is a desert place, send them off. And he says, you feed. Don't send them away, you feed. And then when he's done this passage that sounds Eucharistic, he gives it to them, and they feed. So the disciples are the ones who carry on this feeding, and at the end there are 12 baskets full of broken pieces. And the word used for broken pieces is klasmata, which is the word used in the early church for the Eucharistic species, the host, klasmata. So this is clearly written against the practice of a church celebrating Eucharist. That is immediately followed by Jesus walking on the water, then healing the sick in Gennesaret. Now when he walks on the water, this is the second time he's had control over the water, but the response of the disciples is fear. Do not be afraid, it is I. Use of the divine name. Then he got into the boat, and with them the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded. This is the disciples. For they did not understand about the loaves, for their hearts were hardened. So the disciples aren't doing too well. We just had this incredible miracle, followed by a boat trip, which Jesus again shows that he's Lord of the wind and sea. And he says to them, do not be afraid, ego eimi, it is I, the presence of the divine. But they can't understand. They're not getting the point. He then heals the sick. And people at once recognized him and rushed out to bring the sick on mats. And wherever he went, even if they touched the fringe of his cloak, all were healed. That's the contrast with the disciples. The disciples aren't getting it, but the simple people in Gennesaret are getting it. And then from 7:1 to 23, and I can't do it at great length, Jesus begins to fight with Judas, with the Jewish leaders. And they're fighting him about food, about how to eat, about purification rituals. And he is very critical. And he tells them that they are obeying man-made laws, and in this way abandoning the law of God. And then he says, rightly did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites. This people honours me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. Not a new problem, huh? So this is this is severe criticism of Judaism. And then he goes on with his family, with his disciples, and he tells them what the criteria. Verse 20. It is what comes out of a person that defiles. It is from within the human heart that evil intentions come. And all the evil intentions are met. All these evil things come from within and they defile a person. Judaism will not be told. The Jewish leaders will not be told. They know. And they are honouring him not with their hearts. Now, be careful, we're talking about a literary reality here of this opposition to Jesus' message. They are being used to show how not to approach, to accept or refuse Jesus. That passage is immediately followed by the story of the Syrophoenician woman. And she wants something to eat too, doesn't she? She wants the bread that falls from the table. She's happy to say, yeah, I'm just a dog. I've got nothing. I bring nothing to this discussion except my need. And that is back to back with 7:1-23, which is about people who come up to him and say, you're doing it all wrong. You don't understand. And he is very strong in his negative response to that. This woman comes along and he starts off negative. I can't take the food of the children, which he's already given in chapter 6. He's already given food to the children, hasn't he? And give it to the dogs. Fine. But even the dogs have something that falls from the table. She is contrasted with her faith with the no faith of the Jewish people in 7:1-23. These stories are put back to back as contrast between how not to accept Jesus sufficiently, but how to come to Jesus with nothing to bring to the table except yourself and your failures and who you are, and then Jesus can work. After that, very amazing really, it says, then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of Decapolis. That's like going to Sydney via Perth. In other words, he goes all the way around the north of the lake to the other side of the lake through the Decapolis, which is a group of Greek towns. In this journey, he never walks into Israel. He's always outside of Israel. Tyre, Sidon, north of the lake, Decapolis, he comes to the other side of the lake. And when he gets there, he cures a deaf mute. And for the first time in the gospel, the people, Gentiles, they were in Gentile land, the Gentiles are astounded beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. These are Gentiles citing a messianic passage, Isaiah 35. This is the promise of the Messiah. He will make the deaf hear. And who's making this confession of faith? The first confession of faith in Jesus as the Messiah? Gentiles. Disciples haven't made it yet. The Jewish people haven't made it yet, but the Gentiles do. 8:1-10 is Jesus feeding these people on the other side of the lake. The second feeding miracle is Jesus feeding Gentiles. And why does Mark do this? Why does Mark give us 6-8 with these sort of bookends of feeding miracles with the debates in the middle? Because in the early church, one of the most difficult things that the early Christians had to handle was the admission of Gentiles to their table. Very difficult. Starting from their Jewish background. Then, even as we know from Paul, the idea of the Gentile mission was difficult. Had to be Jewish. This is Mark getting his 2 penneth worth in by showing that even Jesus nourishes in a Eucharistic fashion the people on the Jewish side of the lake, and there are 12 baskets left. This meal's not over. There are still 12 baskets of plasma that are available. Then he comes to the other side of the lake and he feeds Gentiles. And there are 7 baskets over. And 7 is the biblical number for completion. And it's always applied to the Gentiles. Do you know what the name of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible was? Septuagint. 7. How many, in the Acts of the Apostles, how many deacons are picked out of the crowd to feed the non-Jewish women? 7. 7 is the number of the Gentiles. So both of these miracles are put where they are, around this indications of an inability to understand Jesus, who Jesus is, to show Jesus' own openness to Jew and Gentile. Because there's still 12 baskets open for the Jews. There's still 7 baskets open for the Gentiles. This is a universal vocation to the table of the Lord. All spelled out across this little section. The passage ends, and I might come back to this later, with the Pharisees asking for a sign. He's just given them a sign. They want a sign. He then gets into the boat, and the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they only had 1 loaf. And he says to them, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. Don't be like those people in chapter 7. Don't be like those people at the end of chapter 3. The yeast of the Pharisees and the Herod. They said to one another, yeast, he must be talking about the fact that we've got no bread. They're just not understanding anything. Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? We know from 652 that they are. Do you have eyes and fail to see? That's going to dominate the rest of the gospel. See. Do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets are full of broken did you collect? 7. Do you not yet understand? They are not recognising who he is. It's not as he's going to take the 1 loaf and multiply it. That's not the point. The point is that by this stage, the disciples should begin to have some understanding of who it is that's with them. But they don't understand. Now, I'll pick up after a break at verse 22. Now you notice that I've got that last section, Jesus and his disciples. So I've been insisting on how they're struggling, haven't I? Now, it becomes very strongly. You remember he said to them in the boat, having eyes do you not see? Well, immediately after this boat miracle that I just talked about, they come to Bethsaida, and we have the strangest miracle in the Gospel, where Jesus takes 3 shots to get the man to see. He comes along and he can't see at all. Then Jesus puts spittle on his eyes, which was the normal way of, to this day, the Bedouins continually putting spittle on their eyes because it's the natural antiseptic. And so he uses the way that we normally use, and he sees that he doesn't see properly. He sees men like trees, upside down. And then he takes him outside the village and gazes at him, and he sees properly. You've got 3 stages: blindness, sight, but not a correct sight, and then full sight. Now that little miracle, which is not in any other gospel, as you can imagine, the gospels didn't want to put the story of Jesus where he didn't get it right the first time. So they leave that out. But Mark's got it there. It's crucially important because the rest of the gospel is an attempt on the part of Jesus to move his disciples from the blindness that they're showing through partial sight into full sight. So that is more or less the catechesis or the pedagogy of the second half of this gospel. To draw the disciples away from where they are into a fullness of sight. And that's why it starts with Jesus asking Peter at Caesarea Philippi, "Who do people say that I am?" And they use examples of Jewish precursor figures. So John the Baptist, one of the prophets, Elijah. These were all figures that were expected to come back before the Messiah. That's blindness. Okay? That's not to understand who Jesus is. Who do you say that I am? And Peter says, "You are the Christ." That's what he says, "You are the Christ." Now we know from the prologue that he is the Christ. But the Christ can also always be misunderstood. And we'll see that the disciples do misunderstand the Christ because they think that the Christ is a messianic soldier figure. Someone who will take over Jerusalem, set up his authority and kingdom in Jerusalem, and there in a minute they're going to be asking one to be the Prime Minister and the other one to be the Minister for Finance. One on the right side, one on the left side. They're looking for that sort of messianic kingdom. So he warns them not to say anything about that, and he begins to tell them that the Son of Man must go up to Jerusalem and there suffer many things and die, and on the third day rise again. That is the Messiah that Jesus will be. He will not be a glorious Messiah, but he will be a suffering Messiah. Now what has happened across this passage is a movement from no sight, who do you say that I am? One of the precursors. To partial sight, the Christ. That's true, but you've got to understand which type of Christ. To Son of Man, suffering Son of Man. So they're the three stages of understanding Jesus' Messiahship. Now, that takes us through to where we are here. With Peter's confession of Jesus, and Jesus saying, "Don't tell anyone anything about that." And the next section of the gospel begins, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, etc. That's the beginning of the second half of the gospel. However, stories aren't written with walls across the middle. Something is beginning in the first half, that bridges across into the second half. And you'll see here a frame of blind men. In 8:22-26, we've just seen the blind man at Bethsaida. In 10:46-52, we have another blind man, and that's blind Bartimaeus. Now they form a literary frame. Between that literary frame, you have three prophecies of Jesus' death and resurrection. Passion and prediction and the call to take up the cross. 8:27-9:30. Jesus predicts his future death and resurrection, and Peter, who's just got a partial sight in the first half of the gospel, now says, "No way, you're not going to Jerusalem to die." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Now the word Satan, Satana in Aramaic, means the devil, but its primary meaning is stumbling block. Get behind me, stumbling block. The problem is that Peter's trying to dictate terms to Jesus, to block Jesus on his journey to Jerusalem, which he now begins. He's on the way. And in the text, the word way comes up all the time. And Peter becomes a problem because he doesn't want that sort of Messiah. He wants his messianic soldier figure. But then he tells them, if you want to be my disciple, you must take up your cross and follow me. Now, this is the first time in the gospel that Jesus has talked about cross and the necessity to lose oneself for me and for the gospel. Now, this is the first time he's told the disciples about that. And so, this is immediately followed in 9:1 through to 7 with the transfiguration scene. Now, the transfiguration scene is put there because this is the first time that Jesus has told them that they've got to follow him unto death if they want to be his disciples. And so, necessarily, they've got to be asking, who does this guy think he is? To make those sorts of demands. And the transfiguration tells them in vision and by word. And the word from heaven this time, again, like at the beginning, is from God saying, this is my son, listen to him. And at the beginning it was, this is my son, the beloved. Now is, this is my son, listen to him. Yeah, I know he's asking you to do something that you don't understand and you find hard, but listen to him. So you're going to find that each passion prediction is rejected by the disciples. But when the disciples reject it, as Peter does the first one, he never abandons his failing disciples. This is a very important thing in Mark's Gospel. Jesus never fails the failing disciple. Never. Second passion prediction in 9:31 says the Son of Man will be given into the hands of men and they will kill him. That's pretty clear. And when they get back into the house, he asks them, what were you arguing about on the way? They were silent, for on the way they'd argued with one another who was the greatest. Who's top dog? Got it all wrong. And so he takes a child and he uses the word reception. Whoever welcomes that one such child in my name welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me welcomes not me but the one who sent me. Receive, receive, receive. This is what discipleship is about. Not telling Jesus what's going on, but being receptive like a child. It's all coming in. So he instructs them about receptivity. But they're not learning. Because John said, we saw someone casting out demons in your name and we tried to stop him because he was not following us. Well, they're not supposed to be following them. They're supposed to be following Jesus. And if he's doing anything in Jesus' name, then they're fine. Jesus instructs the disciples on, again, simplicity, receptivity. But then in chapter 10, in this middle prediction, you get two passages, the only two passages in the whole of 8:22 to 10:42 where other people come in. This whole section is dedicated to Jesus forming his disciples. Passion prediction, failure of the disciples, Jesus instructing the disciples. The first one he instructs them, take up the cross. The second one he instructs them, receive, be prepared to be servants. So they've got to take up their cross, they've got to be receptive. And then in chapter 10, right out of the blue, you get the discussion with the Pharisees about marriage, which comes from nowhere. And then the discussion with the man about riches, which comes from nowhere. So, right in the middle, disciples who have been called to receptivity and cross and service are given instruction through these two episodes about the need for cross and service and receptivity in the two areas of life that we all find most difficult: possessions and affections. These are not put there by accident. these two stories are right in the middle of this section with Jesus and the disciples on the way. The only time anyone else comes in to instruct about a true understanding of possessions, that they must be put aside when it comes to following Jesus. That this is the one thing this man lacks. And the Jesus idea about unconditional commitment to marriage. And both of these things, as we know, hurt more than anything. So it's very wonderful, really, even in terms of contemporary human psychology, that in a section of the gospel dedicated to discipleship, those two things where we struggle most to be cross-bearing, receptive, and serving disciples in the management of wealth and in our affections, are the two areas that he takes on board and he tells them this is the way it should be. Now always remember that what Jesus asks is the idea. Right? Jesus is asking, when we said at the beginning about he was with the wild beasts and the angels were serving him. It's as if we were in Eden again. Right? It's as if we're in Eden again. So when he talks about possessions and the divorce material and all that, it's as if we were in Eden again. In the beginning, it was not so. In the beginning. So it's important to see what Mark's saying and what then we need to speak more widely about some of these issues, etc. But we can't go into that. Those of you who I've written at length on this divorce question last week. Okay. That takes us to the third passion prediction. Now in the third passion prediction, he goes into all the details. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. They're not doing too well, are they? No. In Mark's Gospel, the most damaging thing to discipleship is fear. Fear. The very last verb in this Gospel is, for they were afraid. The women will run away from the tomb because they're afraid. Fear separates the disciple from Jesus. And then he begins to tell them. This probably won't make them any less afraid. We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, spit upon him, and flog him, and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again. That's a summary of the Passion narrative, isn't it? Even down to the details of the flogging, etc. These were all written 40 years after it's happened. So now Jesus probably originally said the Son of Man will be given into the hands of men and they will kill him. By the time the Gospel's written, they actually describe how that's going to happen. But in terms of reading Mark's Gospel or hearing Mark's Gospel in the 70s of the first century, they know this has happened. And they hear this passion prediction. The fullest and clearest passion prediction of the whole story. And what happens? 2 disciples come up, the sons of Zebedee. We want you to do something for us. Okay, what's that? When we get to Jerusalem, when we hit the big time, we want to be one on the right, one on the left. So one wants to be Prime Minister and the other one Minister for Finance, and they hit the big one. What's beautiful about this Gospel is, with exactly the same words, when Jesus does get to Jerusalem, who's on the right and the left? 2 thieves. Same words. To decide who will be on the right and on the left is not mine, says Jesus. He asks them, are you prepared to follow me? Yes. And he says, then you will. Are you prepared to take up the chalice and follow me? We will. And he said, and you will. Obviously written after these 2 sons of Zebedee have probably already been martyred. When the Gospel was written, they're probably already dead. In the terms of the story, they've still got the wrong messianic idea. But there's this assurance that they will follow him in this way. But then the other 10, thinking that these 2 pushy characters getting in ahead, are angry. And Jesus turns to them and sums up all of this section. He sums that up and he says, this is one of the most important passages in the Gospel, which Pope Francis is really living out for us, thank God, in his flesh. You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognise as their rulers lording over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. Italians would say magari. It would be lovely if that were not the case. It will not be so among you. Christianity should not know this sort of way of life. Amazing. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. Second Passion prediction. You must be the slave of all. For the Son of Man also came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So this section on the disciples has the same rhythm all the time. Passion prediction, failure to accept the passion prediction. Jesus never abandons his Father and disciples. He calls them to cross, he calls them to service, and in the end he says, I'm only asking you to do what I am doing. For the Son of Man also came, not to be served, but to serve, and to lay down his life as a ransom for them. Okay, now 11 through to the end of 13, I'm just going to deal with quickly because we're running out of time. It's what I call endings in Jerusalem. I'll just tell you quickly what happens. He comes into the temple area, and around the sign of a fig tree that is not bearing fruit, its time is there, the time of Jesus is there, it's not bearing fruit. Surrounding that is the story, inside that is the story of what we call the purification of the temple. It's more than that. He gets rid of all the animals, he gets rid of all the coins. The animals are needed for sacrifice. The coins keep the temple pure because people came with coins in their pockets. I don't have any because I'm a poor religious. If you had an effigy on the coin, someone's face, you couldn't take it into the temple area. You couldn't have an image. So you went to this money changes at the court of the Gentiles. You gave your money and they gave you the equivalent money in the coins of Tyre, which had no effigies. You then did what you had to do in the temple, and then when you're coming out, you gave it back and got your money back again. So what Jesus does by getting rid of the money changers and the animals is to stop the cultic practice of the temple. And there's a little phrase in there that says, and he would not allow anybody to carry anything. But the word for anything is skirwas, which means a vessel. He won't allow anybody to bear vessels. So Jesus symbolically brings the temple to an end. First ending. And then it says very beautifully, alone with his disciples, he tells them that there's a new way to go to God. No longer through the temple, but by prayer and by forgiveness. Prayer, faith, and forgiveness takes you to God. Chapter 12, you get into chapter 11 and 12, you know these stories. He has an argument with the Pharisees. He has an argument with the Sadducees. Pharisees about authority, about paying tax. Sadducees about resurrection. And then the scribe. So the three of these leaders in Israel, and he brings them all to silence. And it says in 12:34, and after that, nobody dared ask him any more questions. That brings to an end the leadership of Israel. It's symbolic, As Matthew's gospel ends, he brings temple worship to an end and replaces it with approach to God via prayer and faith and forgiveness. The next section, he brings the leadership of Israel to silence, reduces it to silence. And then chapter 13, the first 23 verses are about the end of the city of Jerusalem. And Mark's gospel is being written about this time, about 70. And it says in chapter 13, you will hear of wars and rumours of wars. It's going on down the road. You will hear of wars and rumours of war. This is not the end. First, the gospel must be proclaimed to the ends of the earth. Chapter 13, verse 10. First, the gospel must. Why? Because Mark's community, living fairly close to Israel, probably in southern Syria, are hearing that the temple's being destroyed, the Romans are wiping it out. Jesus is going to come back tomorrow. They think that the end of time is upon them. We'll talk about that in class today. This urgency of the end of time, which was in the early church. And Mark's Jesus says, no, first the gospel must be preached to all the nations. And then the second half of chapter 13, from verse 24 to 37, tells them, and there will also be an end of the world. Be ready for it. Watch. So 11 to 13 is all about endings. The ending of Jewish culture, the ending of Jewish leadership, the ending of the temple itself, and the end of Jerusalem, and finally the end of the world. And then the Passion story is very beautifully told. I couldn't put that up again. Endings in Jerusalem. Okay? The Passion of Jesus. This is a wonderful. This is a story, a consummate storyteller. In the first 72 verses of chapter 14, you get 11 scenes alternating between negative and positive responses to Jesus. For example, it starts with the plot to kill Jesus. It's followed by the anointing of Jesus' feet. That's followed by Judas joining the plot. That's followed by Jesus telling them to go and prepare a room. That's followed by the meal that they all share together. The sixth scene of 11, that's followed by the indications of the fact that they will betray him and deny him. That's followed by Jesus' prayer, and that's followed by the arrest. So you get this intercalation, we call it. It goes from good to bad, good to bad, good to bad, all the way through, until you get the flight and the denial. So you get this presentation of this last night with these disciples, where the disciples flee, deny, and betray him. Supper, flight, and denial. Then it comes to the Roman. This time there are 9 scenes. The alternation between the positive and the negative responses continues. But in the 5th central scene, in the one before, the central scene is the actual Eucharistic table. In this one, the central scene is actually the crucifixion. Of course, the two match one another, the table and the crucifixion, both at the center. Jesus is crucified. Soldiers ironically proclaim the truth, and the Jewish leaders mock Jesus. Now, this is the question we want to finish on. In the resurrection story of Mark's Gospel, we only have 8 verses. This is a longer ending. If you look at your Bibles, you find there's verses 9 to 20. And that's because in the 2nd century, when they began to put these books together, they didn't like the fact that the Gospel ended and they all forsook him and fled. Or they ran away because they were so frightened. And so they began to add endings. We have at least 3. At the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church recognised the Latin long ending that we now have in our Bibles, but all of our Bibles will indicate in a footnote that this is a later text. And some suggest maybe the last page was lost. I can't imagine that happening. I think it ends in verse 8. Why? Let me talk about that. Women come to anoint Jesus as the sun rises, already a sign of hope. In John's Gospel, when Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, it was still dark. Because she has that long time of unfaith, doesn't she? In John's Gospel. In Mark, the sun's rising as the women go. They find an empty tomb and a young man dressed in a white robe. And he passes on the Easter proclamation. It says, you are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, the crucified one. He is not here. Look at the place where they laid him. And in between it says, he has been raised. So the message is, he has been raised. You were looking for the crucified. He's been raised. He's not in the place where they laid him. This proclamation of Easter is the answer of the question that Jesus asks on the cross. My God, why did you forsake me? The angel says, you weren't forsaken at all. He has been raised. God is the subject. Who rolled back the stone? Who raised Jesus? This is all the action of God that's come into the story, which was so bleak as Jesus was crucified and buried. Now God fills the gaps. Rolls back the stone, raises him from the dead. And the women are told, go and tell the disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him as he promised. We haven't done this in enough detail, but at the Last Supper, when he's telling them you will all fall away. But I will go before you into Galilee. There you will see me. He says that to them at the Last Supper. Then the angel says to them, he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him as he promised. So 14:27, 16:7, same words. So take that seriously. The words are, he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him. They ran away. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. End of gospel. Why? First thing you've got to realise is that when Mark does this in 70, or around about 70, everybody knew about the appearances. Paul's writing in 54 to the Corinthians. And he talks about the appearances in chapter 15. The traditions that lie behind the appearances in Matthew and Luke and John are already a part of the oral tradition of the church. Mark changes what everybody knows. When they read that, they said, well, that's not what happened. So they asked the next question, why did he do this? Why does Mark have the women run away and not tell anyone? When everyone reading this says, he's up to something. He's not just telling us the facts, because the facts he's telling us are wrong. He wants to tell us something about discipleship. The disciples have failed. The last time they appeared was in chapter 14, verse 50, when they all ran away when Jesus was arrested. The only ones who stay are the women. They're with him at the cross, they're with him at the burial, and they find the empty tomb. They are the only ones who remain with Jesus right through the whole story until the last verse. Now, what Mark wants to do is to have ringing in your ears, he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him. The men have failed. The women, although they've done so well, in the end, also failed. Why does Mark do this? Because he wants to tell us that he is going before us into Galilee. There we will see him. The word of Jesus will not fail. Men and women fail. But the word of Jesus will not fail. We have the Gospel of Mark. What does that mean? It means there was a community in Mark. It means that they somewhere had their Galilee experience. But out there, between the resurrection and where we are now, is a Galilee where Jesus goes before us to meet us in our failure. This is a very Pauline message. The message of Paul is men and women are not saved by their own actions. They are saved by God's grace. And this is a narrative form of saying the disciples failed, the women were good, and even though they didn't fail, I'm telling you they failed, because I want you to know that nobody gives you the risen life, except the gift of God who is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, because that's what he told you will happen. See the point? That's why I put the resurrection of Jesus and of the disciples. And of the disciples. They rise because of the word of Jesus promised to them. And that hasn't failed because we're here tonight. Okay? Not because we keep succeeding, but because we keep failing and we keep having Galilees. Alright? And that's what that ending's all about. Thank you very much.